Welcome back. So in this video, we're going to talk about the ideas of Israel Kirzner, another person from the School of Austrian Economics, although best time my understanding is he's not actually Austrian, he was from the United Kingdom, but he fell into that kind of tradition of Austrian economics. Now his perspective on entrepreneurship is quite different from Schumpeter's. Now Schumpeter, of course we talked about in the last video, describes creative destruction, right? They both share a common assumption that entrepreneurship or supply and demand curves move toward equilibrium. So in Schumpeter's world, you destroy one supply and demand curve and create another, and it continues to move towards equilibrium, right? Kirzner has a very different perspective, right? He says that the economy moves towards equilibrium. So I've drawn here. I drew it, in advance of my recording because I remember how squeaky it was in the last video. All right, so he says, you know what? Actually, this is the ideal end state between supply and demand here. But sometimes supply and demand might be on some of these other points. Okay? And so what that means is the entrepreneur is an arbitrager. It's a really, really smart person who's really, really alert and can say, aha, there is more demand than there is supply. There is less supply than there is demand. However you want to look at it, for whatever reason, this equilibrium curve is out of sync. Okay? Let me give an example of an entrepreneur as an arbitrager. Arbitrage basically means you take advantage of some sort of a gap between supply and demand, usually in kind of a momentary sort of situation. So a few years ago, my dad and I are familiar with this certain bourbon. I won't name it because I don't think I'm supposed to do that in a YouTube video. But it's not like a particularly expensive bourbon. It's just a very good bourbon. It's about 50 bucks maybe. But the problem is you can't find it anywhere. It's so hard to get a hold of this special bourbon, right? Because they only make a certain number of barrels per year. And, they give each liquor store, a bottle or two a quarter, and then everybody snaps it up right away. And usually it's the liquor store employees that get it. So it's hard to get any of this bourbon, okay? So a few years ago, they actually used to sell barrels at distilleries, entire barrels of bourbon. And what you do is you'd buy the whole barrel, and then they put it in bottles for you and put your label on it or whatever. And that was one way to get a hold of bourbon, like a special blend of bourbon or a special barrel of bourbon just for you. So my dad and I said, what if we start buying barrels of this bourbon? Because we can afford to buy the barrels. We've got the money. We've got the time to do it. We put our own label on it, of course under their brand name, but then we get a liquor license and we start selling it. Because you see, every time you bought a barrel, I think a barrel was like 250 bottles, right? So we'd have 250 bottles and we could sell it in areas where, yes, people want to drink this bourbon, i.e. there is demand for it, but there's no supply, and we can mark up the price. This is an example of arbitrage. Okay, just to tell you the end of the story. Turns out the distiller doesn't sell barrels of that bourbon anymore, so we couldn't do that. But that's an example of arbitrage in action. Okay? But there's a lot of criticisms of Kirzner's understanding of entrepreneurship. The first is that he doesn't think that entrepreneurs create anything ex nihilo. Ex nihilo. Ex nihilo is Latin for out of nothing. Why couldn't we have just said out of nothing? Well, when you're an academic writer, you need to say whatever you're trying to say in Latin, ancient Greek, French, or German. It just makes you sound more sophisticated. That's the only reason we have to say it ex nihilo. Okay? So Kirzner does not understand that entrepreneurs can create opportunities ex nihilo. In fact, they can only operate within the rules of the existing market. Okay? Well, thinking about the bourbon example. Well, what if all of a sudden people turns out they like mead or cider or, I don't know, they like something distilled from a fruit or drink or fruit or vegetable that nobody's ever even heard of, right? Suddenly that's a brand new opportunity, a brand new market that didn't exist before. And so Kirzner's framework actually doesn't work. Right? So he doesn't really talk about entrepreneurs being able to create anything out of nothing. So that's one of his critiques. Another problem that he comes into fire for, actually there's two. He never talks about entrepreneurs making mistakes. He always assumed that an entrepreneur is this like really smart person who can perceive these imbalances in the market, and then as they create their job and they start to take advantage of this supply and demand discrepancy, then they move the market back towards perfect equilibrium. Basically, the entrepreneur is the invisible hand of Adam Smith. But he doesn't think about the fact that entrepreneurs are wrong, or that they could be wrong. And in fact, we know since about 80% of entrepreneurs fail before the 5th year, we know actually it's more normal for an entrepreneur to be wrong than the entrepreneurs to be right. And Kirzner just ignores this whole thing. So that's kind of unfortunate. The other thing that Kirzner does not take into account is the need for capital to launch an entrepreneurial enterprise. And I don't have an explanation for this, or why he ignores this. I mean, you think about it. I just gave the example of my dad and I thinking about buying barrels of bourbon, right? Well, a barrel was like, I don't know, $5,000 or $6,000. Like, so you have to have that money, or at least have access to that money, in order to buy the barrels, in order to take advantage of that arbitrage. For Kirzner, it's almost like an entrepreneur can start a business without actually fronting any of the capital themselves. So this is kind of weird too. I mean, sure, in Adam Smith's time, like when he was writing the 1700s, it's possible that some entrepreneurs might not have needed a significant or even a substantial amount of capital to get started. Like you think of some shop owner on the streets of Glasgow, what do? They put up a little sign, a little hut, and they start selling lemonade like, 6-year-olds do. And I guess, in those kinds of circumstances, yeah, an entrepreneur doesn't need capital. However, when Kirzner was writing, in fact, I think he was even writing into the 1990s, we know this is just not the case. So don't have an answer for you as to why he thought that. But that's another critique of Kirzner. Great. So hopefully you like this quick and dirty breakdown of Kirzner. Feel free to give me a subscribe, a thumbs up. If you have any questions, post them down the bottom, and I'll be happy to answer you within 24 hours. And in our next video, we're going to talk about Ludwig Lachmann and some of his contributions to Austrian economics. I'm looking forward to seeing you then.